Okay, my name is Eric Yakes, and today I'm going to be talking about the monetary revolution. Booty. Okay, so quick background. My background's in finance. I studied finance and econ at Creighton University in Omaha, not too far from here, and then I got my CFA charter. I started off working in technical areas of finance at a management consulting firm and then a private equity fund, and then all the while was following Bitcoin and decided to jump in the industry. The first thing I did was write a book. And for a lot of you people that are, thinking about getting involved in the industry, I wasn't totally certain of what I wanted to do. I just knew that I had a few years runway, and I got, jumped in head first and decided to figure out what I thought the industry needed. Oh, perfect. Sweet. So anyways, the Bitcoin community allowed this to take off very quickly, and it was a #1 bestseller book on money and monetary policy when I launched it. And it's been growing significantly from there. I've paid for no marketing, and just the community starts to engage with people and bring people up, and it's very easy to get involved if you're willing to put in the work. So, the birth of a revolution. I think that we are currently witnessing the birth of a monetary revolution. There's a quote from author Eric Hoffer. He wrote this book, The True Believer. He says, in a time of drastic change, it is the learners who inherit the future. The learned usually find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. And I think that's very relevant today. I'm going to start going pretty rapid fire here, so let's tune up. If you haven't gotten any coffee, let's get into it. All right, in order to understand Bitcoin, you need to understand money and banking. So I'm going to go high level through some of this. What is the purpose of money? So over here on the left side, we have money, which enables trade, which enables specialization, which enables wealth. And when we think about that, sorry, I need my water. When we think about that, the best way to start is with, if we remove money from an economy and we're dealing with a barter economy, it takes significant amount of time and resources in order for people to trade with one another. So money implicitly decreases that cost of trade. And the better form of money you have, the lower that cost of trade becomes. So it ultimately enables to trade in a very efficient way, the better the money we have, which enables us to specialize and produce better goods, which ultimately enables greater wealth. So money is kind of the core foundation of what enables us to create the trade of all other goods and services. And having good money affects all economic activity in a much more efficient way. So over here on the right, throughout history, we can kind of see that goods emerged privately to fulfill this purpose. We started off with, bees, flints, furs, shells, all these different types of goods that all fulfilled different purposes. They had monetary properties that made them better or worse forms of money. And eventually, we got to a point in history where this evolved into the precious metals, which we can see here on the right. So really quickly, I want to ask you guys a question. What do you think it means when we say that money needs to be backed by something? Does anybody have an answer for that?
It's a lie.
Yeah, so it's kind of a product of path dependency throughout history. But before we can answer this question, we need to understand the monetary properties. This is a very involved graphic, but if there's anything I want you to understand throughout this presentation, it's this graphic. So at the top, we have Carl Menger, who defined money as the most saleable good in his book, The Origins of Money in the 19th century. Defines it as that which has the lowest rate of declining margin utility will be chosen to facilitate indirect trade. That sounds pretty nasty, but indirect trade, that just means money. Declining marginal utility means goods that, as you consume them consecutively, they maintain a certain amount of utility, but it decreases over time. So like with pizza, by your 5th or 6th piece of pizza, it doesn't have much utility for you. A house would be an example of something that has a pretty high rate. Your first house matters quite a bit. The second one is nice, but it doesn't really matter that much. Money is that which has the lowest rate. It's something that you can continue to consume over and over again, and it doesn't lose utility or has a very small decline in utility. So that's the broadest definition of money. And then Safety and Amos kind of broke this off across 3 different dimensions, across time, space, and scales. And You've probably heard about these purple boxes in the middle, which are the functions of money: store, value, medium of exchange, unit of account. So each one of those functions kind of maps to its purpose within a particular dimension. So money moves value in some sort of way. So across time, it moves it across time to the future. Across space, it can move it across distances and geographies. And across scales, it can be easily grouped and divided. So each function of money allows it to move value within that particular dimension. And the way that we can kind of assess money and think about what makes money good or better at doing these functions is by these green boxes down here, which are properties that allow it to fulfill those functions in a certain way. So something that is very good store value over time is something that's very scarce. And the key point about scarcity is that it's defined as the rate of change in its supply. The initial supply of something is somewhat arbitrary, but it's a question of the rate of change and how much it dilutes the original holders of it over time that affects its value. So if we kind of look at this comparison between precious metals and then when they evolved into paper money, we can kind of look at a comparison of why did we choose paper money? And the idea was, well, if we look at these properties down here, paper money was much more portable than precious metals. It was much easier to move it across distances, especially when we had inventions like, double entry bookkeeping and the printing press and the telegraph. I mean, that conducted trade all over Europe in paper, and it was highly, highly efficient. It was also much more divisible, and it was also much more fungible, meaning it was easy to create things that were like for like. It took a lot more time to make coinage and all these systems to make them very similar, and they're easy to manipulate. So those were the advantages of paper money. The key disadvantage was that paper money wasn't scarce. So that's why we initially started it being backed by precious metals, because precious metals were scarce. And they said, okay, well, if we do adopt this more efficient form of money in all these other categories, then we want to have precious metals backing it so it still maintains that property of scarcity. And that was the initial reason that money needed to be backed by something, because when we evolved to paper, it wasn't scarce. Okay, the agency problem. With the agency problem, it's where a conflict of interest exists between a principal and an agent. The agent will take advantage of the principal acting in their own self-interest, resulting in some form of moral hazard. So a good way I like to think about this is if you hire a courier for you and there's, need to deliver something from A to B. And if it's something inexpensive like papers that mean nothing to them, then they're going to do that for whatever you pay them. But if you ask them to deliver, millions of dollars for you, you're probably not going to see them again. So that's where that conflict of interest exists, is when you give people control as agents over something that's much more valuable to them, then they're ultimately going to defect against that interest. And this is an economic law that we see time and time again. And we see that this is obviously very prevalent in any sort of institution or agent that deals with money. That's why it's the most regulated industry in the world. That's why it has the highest cases of fraud. And the agency problem is very prevalent. So governments typically would step in to kind of protect us from this agency problem, but we can see throughout history that they ultimately had the same conflict of interest, and they ultimately took advantage of it in a very similar way. So something I kind of define in my book is that money is the most saleable good, and it's thus more subject to this problem than any other good. And right here we see a picture of coin clipping, which was a kind of like one of the first very tangible ways that we can see agents taking advantage of our money. So we're going to walk through the evolution of money. So in antiquity, over here on the left, we have some beads. And a lot of these were created from bone or shells or things like that. But we had all these different forms of primitive monies. They were picked because of these monetary properties. But what was really interesting about primitive money was that it was largely decentralized. So that means it was created. Anybody could create it. Anybody could really store it. Everybody stored money on themselves, on their person, or they had treasure chests that they would hide places, things like that. And anybody also verified it. So because money was created in a decentralized way and there weren't agents who were in charge of controlling it back then, everybody was very aware of what constituted good money, and that made verification very easy among these small localized communities, think like hunter-gatherer tribes. So as we started to evolve and we move into the precious metals, well, precious metals required, smithing and mining, and the production became specialized into certain groups. Storage became specialized into certain groups. And we ultimately had to trust agents with money. And a key example of where we can see where that moral hazard happened is one issue with precious metals before we got into coinage systems was that they were very hard to divide. You had to like chop pieces off of them all the time. There's a lot of loss in that. You'd lose little flakes, and that's actually a lot of value when you're losing gold all the time through trade. So we developed coinage systems to create standard weights to make it much more divisible. So people, rather than trusting the weight, they trusted the coin. And merchants realized very quickly that they could reduce the weight of the coin and they could take advantage of people through that process. So every time somebody would come to them with a coin, they would shave off little pieces and go through transactions all day doing that and eventually accumulate enough of those shavings and then mint their own coins themselves. And they would effectively inflate the money supply and be able to exchange something for nothing with other people. So the first coinage systems were implemented by the kings of Lydia in 600 BC, and it was kind of justified based on this phenomenon occurring. And the irony is that once these governments took control of these coinage systems and started minting money themselves, they started doing the exact same thing. We can see a similar pattern, not just with the production of money, but with the storage of money as well. And that was particularly on set once we transitioned to paper money. Our modern banking systems are kind of predicated upon those in England. And the London goldsmith bankers, if you read into that history, they were storing gold in vaults and issuing receipts, and they started issuing receipts much more beyond the amount of gold that they would store in the vaults for people that were supposed to be redeemable. So there would be 1 bar of gold and 10 receipts out there floating around, everybody thinking that they own it. And that was kind of the dawn of fractional reserve banking. And that started to result in boom and bust cycles. Well, what happened? Government stepped in. The Bank of England was created to backstop a lot of issues in this system, and they started doing the exact same thing. So at each stage of the monetary evolution, society traded trust for efficiency. We trusted these agents because these were more efficient systems. We had a reason to do that, and the issues are much more obvious in hindsight. But not understanding the cost of entrusting that money to agents at the time caused quite a bit of issues. So once we created the central bank, there's a very consistent historical pattern that you can see. And I kind of break this in between the emergence and the outcome of central banks. So emergence is that there's some sort of need to finance heavy government expenditures, most often due to war. And the bank was created to print money and lend it to a government. For this money to be accepted, the government had to confer some type of legal status upon it. So somewhat of a partnership between the banks. The banks say, okay, well, we're going to call your money good money, and you guys make sure you're lending to us, and then we can say that we don't have a conflict of interest. And then the outcome was that the bank would issue paper money far beyond the amount of gold that was backing it. Once this became public knowledge, people would call in their deposits. This debased the currency. Government implemented price controls. That caused supply shortages, and then further economic dislocations start occurring when prices start getting messed up, and this resulted in wealth inequality, political discontent, civil disobedience, or some form of regime change. And it's funny how similar this all is to what's happening right now. Okay, the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is the fourth central bank of the U.S. Its predecessor was actually closed after the chairman created a deliberate economic contraction to try to defraud Andrew Jackson's campaign when he was going for his second term. So central banks had a pretty bad taste in the public's mouth, and when the Federal Reserve was being created, it was by a group of about 6 members. There was a senator, treasury secretary, and a bunch of Wall Street bankers. And they all got together and said, we need to create another central bank. We need to create this partnership between the politicians and Wall Street. And in our Constitution, the government isn't allowed to coin money. We kind of heard about this a little bit in the news with the debt ceiling. So the government's not allowed to coin money, but they are allowed to issue debt. So they create a separate agency that buys that debt from them. They create a buyer who will always be ready to buy their debt no matter how much they expand it. So that was kind of the idea of this partnership. And so this group got together, and they knew it would be a hard sell to the public, and they enlisted Harvard and Princeton and University of Chicago. And mind you that this was around 1914. The study of economics was somewhat of a recent phenomenon. This wasn't a very this wasn't one of the major departments of universities, so it was kind of up and coming. So they enlisted these academics who were kind of, trying to get established and trying to get in front of the public eye at this cutting edge industry. And they got them to produce a lot of research that ultimately sold the public on establishing the central bank just prior to World War I. So its publicly stated mandate was to reduce economic volatility. And since the inception of the Federal Reserve, we've had on average about 16 recessions, and that's a recession on average about 7 years. So the Federal Reserve has kind of patently failed at its intended mandate since inception, but remains to today. And there's a lot of Nobel Prize winners who would agree with that. So how this actually works is that every time the US government issues a treasury security, that's creating money. And then it goes into our banking system, and then that gets further expanded when the banking system starts to further loan out that money. So we have this way that we can publicly expand money, and then we have this way that the private banks also expand our money supply. So what that means is that, prior to this system being created in 1971, we used to be on a gold standard. So money could be partially created through debt at a public level, but it still had to be tied to some percentage of gold. And then once we repealed that under Nixon in 1971, then it was purely just debt. When we issued debt, then we have new money. So our money is backed by debt. Money is created when debt is issued. And a huge misconception, you see politics cater to this all the time. If we repaid our debt, we actually wouldn't have money. The foundation for our economy is based in debt. So the problem is that it's very circular and it's very volatile. So what it does, it creates economic volatility because we have this fractional reserve. If you were to think about using money as a scarce asset, while we know its supply is going to exist, that doesn't expand or contract, whereby credit can expand and contract very quickly. And that creates quite a bit of volatility within our economy when it does that. So fractional reserve banking, and this causes these economic booms and busts that cause recessions on average every 7 years. The central bank is a solution every single time in those to backstop these recessions. So we, pay off this debt contraction with more debt. And it sounds like some sort of, crazy idea, but really all it is us, the default still happens. When they say the U.S. government can't default, they are defaulting every single time they print debt to pay off debt. It's just a socialized default because it's devaluing the wealth of everybody else in society. So it makes everybody else, the taxpayer, and not even the taxpayer, everybody who uses money is paying for these defaults with each economic contraction through monetary inflation. So the biggest thing people have an issue with are a lot of these bailouts that occur on Wall Street, and that's a very tangible, salient example in modern society of moral hazard that exists from giving agents control over this system. And with each business cycle, we accumulate a little bit more debt relative to the size of our economy. So what are the signs that things are going to get really bad? What are the signs that we could have like another Great Depression or something like that? Well, if we look, malinvestment is currently at a historic high. So the debt productivity levels are about as low as they've ever been, meaning we have littered the economy with so much debt that it's been invested in so many bad projects that we're producing all these things that people really don't want that bad. And the capital allocation mechanism has been screwed up with how we manipulate interest rates in our money supply. And that causes a ton of malinvestment. And that's kind of that's the experience that I came from. We specialized in buying out companies that were distressed or going into bankruptcy. And, I'll never forget, we got hired to do a liquidity review for Sun Edison before they went bankrupt, which was the largest renewable energy company in the world at the time. And they had about $700 million of completely worthless wind turbines sitting in a warehouse that they had bought because of this, move fast and break things mentality. All they did was capital raise and just spend the money as quick as they could. And then all of a sudden they just went bankrupt one day and poof, all the value goes because there were these turbines sitting on their balance sheet that Wall Street said were worth something that everybody all of a sudden realized weren't worth anything. So that's a really good example of how malinvestment works, and we see a ton of that in the economy right now. We can see it in the stock market. We can see it in all asset prices. Overconsumption, happiness levels in the U.S. have continued to decline, but debt and consumption continue to rise. And then if we look at this chart, we can see a really good comparison of wealth inequality and political extremism right now. So if we go back to the 20s and 30s and during the Depression era, we can see that wealth inequality was at its peak, and there was also an area of populace. And then if we go to today, once again, we can see that we're returning to that peak wealth inequality, and we can see the extreme populism that's starting to emerge in our society. These are all very strong symptoms that we've accumulated too much debt in proportion to the size of our economy, and we are on the brink of some type of regime change. So in summary, money emerged privately and was largely decentralized. It maintained 6 properties that kind of guided its adoption over time. As money evolved, society traded trust for efficiency, and then eventually moral hazard ensued, and this resulted in the boom and bust cycles that we see today. So society's solution with each step in each crisis was sold to us by the politicians typically to further centralize the system, and that kind of culminated in the central bank. So today we stand in the most centralized financial system, completely debt-based with nothing backing it in 4,000 years of financial history. This is uncharted territory. We've never been in a global system like this. Malinvestment, overconsumption, wealth inequality, political extremism, all these things are at historic levels right now. And societies that are subject to a fiat monetary system are transacting with money that benefits the agents of the system at the cost of the participants who assume the agents are acting in good faith. It's long-winded, but I think that that's the way that you can summarize what's going on right now. So what can we do about it? We can decentralize the monetary system so that it's not controlled by any single interest. Nobel Prize laureate Friedrich Hayek said in 1984, "I don't believe we shall ever have good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. That is, we cannot take it violently out of the hands of government. All we can do is by some sly roundabout way introduce something that they can't stop." Nobel laureate Milton Friedman in 1999 said that, "I think the internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash, a method whereby on the internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A." Wow. These guys were smart. So, I think one of the hardest things about understanding Bitcoin is that people aren't very familiar with decentralized software. We try to put it in the box of centralized software in our minds, but it's just fundamentally different. So, the Bitcoin network is a network of nodes, and a node is just a computer that has memory and processing power, and it contributes it. So just like how when you log onto Facebook and you are inputting information and Facebook is outputting information to you, it's using centralized warehouses of computers that contribute their memory and processing power to allow all of that to happen. So the idea with Bitcoin was that, well, if we can get all the incentives aligned and we can make everybody, communicate with each other and come to agreement, we can get all the computers working together properly, then we can actually decentralize that hardware so that anybody can just contribute their memory and processing power from a computer and allow this network to function. But the incentives needed to be aligned correctly in order for this to work. So that's what Bitcoin did, and it created incentives so that nodes would all route, verify, and mine transactions onto a blockchain, and they all pretty much download a software similar to, but this is the largest downloaded one, Bitcoin Core, and there's about 12,000 nodes that are supporting this network around the world today. And anybody can change that personal software on their computer however they want to change it. It's not really, that doesn't mean Bitcoin changes, that means your software changes. And if you want to be compatible with the network, then you can't change your software too much. You need to make sure that it still follows the rules that everybody else is following. Otherwise, it's just not going to be compatible. So in order to change Bitcoin, it requires people to achieve consensus about things. People have to agree we're all going to download something to our softwares, and we're all going to agree that this would be good. And then everybody does it, and then everybody's compatible with one another. So it's really like the most democratic system that we've ever created, because it truly does require consensus. And the only changes that would occur in a system like that are changes that truly do benefit the majority as a whole. Okay, so a quick walk through the life cycle of a transaction. If you download the Bitcoin software, and then you give me your Bitcoin address, and I can send you a Bitcoin, and then the software that you have will connect to a bunch of other nodes. It's about 8, and it uses what's called a gossip protocol, which sounds complicated, but through computers, and we can move, information at light speed, it's actually very rapid. And what it does is every time you want to send a transaction or receive something, you communicate that to all the nodes you're connected to, and then they communicate it to all of the other nodes they're connected to. So in about 40 seconds, 95% of the network has heard of a transaction. So that's how information propagates throughout the network. So I send you that Bitcoin, and it gets propagated throughout the network. Everybody updates their individual ledgers to say, okay, this is a good transaction, but they don't do that until they've verified that it follows the rules. So that's how bad transactions get stopped if they're trying to do something fraudulent, because everybody's verifying. So some of the nodes are miners. So everybody has their individual copy. So how do we all agree upon this one copy that we're all going to say is the right copy we're going to follow? Because everybody can have minor differences in their copy, but there is this publicly agreed upon copy that everybody continues to follow. And that's done through the mining process, where there's particular types of nodes that have a very, very high degree of processing power, and these are solving this complex math problem. And the reason that they're doing that is because it requires them to expend a lot of energy. And by expending a lot of energy, it creates the proper incentive. So if it costs you a lot to try to add transactions into the blockchain with these mining computers, you have to spend a ton of money on your energy costs, then you're only going to do that if you deem it to be profitable to you, meaning you deem that these are going to be valid transactions that will make it into the blockchain. Because if you expend all this energy and they're not, then they're going to get rejected by the rest of the network. So it creates a very high degree of security, because if people tried to fraudulently include something on the blockchain, they would have to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars at the current network size to be able to do that. So we create security through cost. And that's one of the key ideas behind Bitcoin. And there's disagreement about the energy costs of that today. But by reducing the cost of energy and these alternative protocols that they're making, you're actually reducing the security of those protocols as well. So that's a key piece that I think that gets overlooked. So once they solve this problem, they will communicate, hey, we solved the mining problem. We've added it to the blockchain. I'm going to communicate to the other nodes. The other nodes check it follows the rules and say, okay, they actually did solve it. We're adding it to our blockchain. And then we're all going to start doing the next block and throwing all the new transactions in the next block. So on and so forth. This happens every 10 minutes. So incentives, what does this do? Because the rules of Bitcoin don't change, because it requires complete consensus for anything to change, which is an incredibly unlikely scenario. Bitcoin supply doesn't change. We know that every time a block gets added, it's following these rules. And these rules say that a block will get added every 10 minutes, and it will be this fixed supply of Bitcoin. So we know that the supply isn't going to change. And because of that, it remains the scarcest form of money in the world. And it has superior monetary properties. Because it's the scarcest form of money in the world, people choose to mine it to earn Bitcoins. This brings more miners into the network. Because people choose to mine it, the network becomes more secure, meaning it gets more competitive. The cost of mining something rises. It gets more secure to be a part of the network. And as the network gets more secure, its probability of success continues to increase. What does that do? Well, when the probability of success increases, more investors are now attracted to Bitcoin. And we see that over the past year. All these institutions are like, okay, this thing's of a pretty significant size. It has, over a decade-long track record of success. We haven't seen any sort of failures. Maybe we should start putting money into this thing. And that trend is going to continue until the guy that who absolutely despises Bitcoin is forced into it one day. Bitcoin's monetary properties also ensure a positive feedback loop, because the question becomes, well, how would this turn negative? What if the price declines? What if miners leave the network? And what fundamentally supports this positive feedback loop is that because Bitcoin has the best monetary properties, there are people who are aware of that, and even through very large contractions, will continue to hold it until proven wrong. So when we look at this positive feedback loop over here on the left, price speculation attracts miners, increases security, keeps going. That generates a very, very powerful network effect. And from what we can see, Bitcoin's adoption is exponential, and we're currently about where we were with the internet in 1997. We're outpacing that rate right now. So what we're really witnessing is the birth of a new monetary standard, and that hasn't happened in over a millennia. So this is a very crazy thing that we're undergoing right now. So, new monetary standard. What does that look like? There's a lot of disagreement in this area because there's a lot of apples to oranges comparisons that people will make. You'll hear people say like, oh, well, Bitcoin has slow transactions, and look at how fast Visa does transactions. It can never work as money. And what you have to understand is that Bitcoin's being built as this monetary base layer. So the proper comparison of Bitcoin would be to like our ACH banking system or to our Fedwire system or any of these systems where if you want to move money from A to B that's physical settlement in a bank account, which takes days or weeks and requires you to tell people who you are and where the money is going. And you could be potentially restricted and you're going to be tracked by the IRS and all these other things. Bitcoin does that same settlement, a physical settlement, in about 10 minutes. Well, technically about an hour to be certain. But so that's the proper comparison of Bitcoin as a form of settlement layer. Now, its throughput isn't high enough for small payments. So just like in our current system where we have that settlement layer and then we have credit card companies and all these other payment processors that are built on top of that. When you think about Venmo, you do a bunch of Venmo transactions, but then when you actually want to send that money to your bank account, it takes a few days for that to happen. So that's the physical settlement piece. On top of that's just a credit layer where Venmo just updates accounts on their level, and then they maintain reserves and all these other things. So there's going to be a bunch of companies like that need to exist on top of Bitcoin, and actually this technology enables us to do those types of credit functions in a more collateralized and safer way, which we're building out called the Lightning Network. So what we can see is that Bitcoin is this alternative decentralized financial system, and individuals are freely choosing to enter it, but it's not fully developed yet, and we're watching that be built out in real time. It obviously cannot compete with our current financial system in terms of utility and products and services, but that's happening at a very rapid pace. So this is kind of a graphic I built out to give you like a high level understanding of how that ecosystem looks. And if you look over here on the left, we have our legacy financial system. And if you want to convert your dollars to Bitcoin, you can go through this system into Bitcoin in a variety of ways. You can go through an exchange like Coinbase. You can go through peer-to-peer exchange like Local Bitcoins. You could receive it as payment for something you do, or you could actually invest in mining equipment and mine it yourself. And then once you get into the Bitcoin system, you can exchange it peer-to-peer with people if you want, which is very important, always having the option to have a peer-to-peer payment. Because in our current system, outside of our cash, which is highly impractical, we don't have that option. So that is a huge enabler of freedom to always have the option to opt out of any sort of intermediary and be able to directly pay people yourself. You could put into wallet storage, and if you put into wallet storage, you can either self-custody it yourself, which requires quite a bit of education to do properly and securely. And once again, to a similar point as a peer-to-peer, this is another form of, in the military, they call it like deterrence theory. You have really big guns so that you never have to use them. You have peer-to-peer exchange, you have self-custodied wallets so that institutions who are providing you services know that you can always opt out of their services if you want. Today, it's incredibly hard to be able to actually do that. So having that weapon is a form of deterrence theory that keeps institutions in check so that they don't take advantage of you and they have to worry about their reputations. And then lastly, back to the payment piece, you can put into a payment channel, and this is called the Lightning Network. And it's effectively like if you and another person, think about it kind of like your credit card. On your credit card, they give you, a credit limit. It would effectively be like a collateralized credit card. You and another party would both send funds, and you agree to collateralize small payment transactions between those two pieces. It's not perfect. There's a lot of issues because you can get into complications with like, if you and the other party both fund an account, say of $10,000, it's locked in. You guys can do as many transactions between that you want. But what if you guys have a disagreement about something? If you have a disagreement, you both have to agree to remove your money out of the collateralization. So if there is disagreement, it gets complicated on how that ultimately gets resolved. So they're working on figuring these issues out right now. But the system's being used in a very tangible way. And it's providing a lot of value, and it's growing very rapidly. And it's this, along with third-party intermediaries that we see down here, are going to be operating in some form, providing people different services for payments and storing their Bitcoin. But the most important piece of when I hear a lot from people like, oh, are we just, going back to the same system if we put our money with, different financial intermediaries? Well, no, because we have a system that we can opt out into with self-custody and peer-to-peer exchange if we truly want to. And that's the important piece. So, Bitcoin versus other money. We're going to go monetary property by monetary property, left to right. Starting with scarcity on the left, Bitcoin is the scarcest form of money in the world. Its inflation rate is about 1.8% right now. Gold has typically ranged between 1.5% to 2.5% throughout history. That inflation rate gets cut in half every 4 years by the algorithm. So that's what it's determined. So, it's going to be under 1% by 2024. And because it's an asymptote, it continues to decline. So we know with certainty that it is going to be lower and lower in the future, whereas, gold is a fixed amount that fluctuates. Durability. Because Bitcoin is purely digital, it is about as durable as the internet, which is a highly resilient network. And if the internet ever goes down, then we're going to have quite a bit more problems than just Bitcoin. And acceptability is the key piece. That's what's currently limiting Bitcoin when you compare it to other forms of money. And that's why we're all here, and that's why we're working on this. But as Bitcoin grows more accepted at a global level, then it will be superior in nearly every respect. Portability, you can move Bitcoin across the globe. There was a transaction for, what was it? Udi, do you remember it was like a few billion last week or something for 28 cents? Yeah, is that right? Yeah. So, you can move massive amounts of money for very cheap across the world within an hour. And you can do that all without having to tell anybody who you are, ask anybody for permission, or be tracked by anybody. And that is incredibly, incredibly powerful. It is far and away more portable than anything else we've ever seen. Divisibility, you can go down to about the 8th decimal place, and that could even go further in the future with different technologies. Fungibility, Bitcoin's not perfectly fungible. I won't waste time on the details of that, but there could be some complications with its fungibility in the future. But nothing that is, horrible, just complications. And lastly, kind of what I define in my book is a seventh property. And what the point that I make is that throughout time, we gave up this trust for efficiency. And it was because we needed to trust agents in order to have that efficiency in our money throughout time. But Bitcoin created almost a need for a seventh property, or it resolved the issue to have a seventh property whereby we don't have to trust institutions and we can still maintain not just the same amount of efficiency, but even more. So not only is it better at everything, but it also is trustless, and it's a true innovation. And I think any form of money in the future that you would assess that needs to be competing with Bitcoin needs to maintain a seventh property of immutability, meaning that the rules don't change. And that's enabled by its decentralized production and storage. So, Bitcoin is an emerging monetary system where the rules are determined by pure consensus instead of the decisions of 7 politically elected leaders. It is designed for pure fairness and meritocracy to benefit the many instead of the few, and it will remove this moral hazard that is inherent in our system. So there's a lot of people that join Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, and they come in because they're interested for a variety of different reasons. Some people like the technology. A lot of people like it as an investment. Some people here for, freedom, or the political implications of it. Some people have a very moral imperative that they're following when they join. And there's all these different groups of people who like Bitcoin for all these different reasons. But the question is, what really drives a revolution, and what is it that's going to continue to have, ardent supporters and loyal followers continue to accumulate within this new world? And going back to Eric Hoffer, he said, many who join a rising revolutionary movement are attracted by the prospect of sudden and spectacular change in their conditions of life. A revolutionary movement is a conspicuous instrument of change. And I think that that's the most important thing that everybody's saying, and anybody who's joined Bitcoin, is that it changes people's lives, and it allows people to store their wealth for the first time in a more effective way than they've ever seen before. And that's going to drive this revolution. Thank you. I can take questions for anybody. If anybody. Yeah.
Do you foresee where Bitcoin can become the reserve currency?
Absolutely. There's a variety of different ways that it could go, and I think, and this is highly speculative, I don't think anybody really totally knows the answer to this, but I think that it'll be a mixture of a lot of different avenues. Ideally, it would mostly be privatized, but I do see there could be an interim period where, so there's a lot of game theory that goes on when you think about this question. At an international level, those who are, so the US is the reserve global currency, right? And one of the exorbitant privileges of being a reserve currency is that we can print dollars and trade them with other economies for their goods and services. So we can trade nothing for something. And because they're all on the reserve, we are also, when we print dollars, we're inflating their currencies by inflating our own. So that allows us to effectively extract wealth out of other countries. Now, it doesn't cover that cost, but that's the primary benefit of being a reserve currency. So when we kind of look at this at an international level, there's a lot of economies that are kind of on the fringe, that are either on a dollar system or not even on a dollar system. And those that are kind of furthest removed, like outside the G7, some of these emerging economies, particularly like South America, those that are on this dollar system that don't have secure property rights and they have corrupt leaders that are typically printing money, their money is subject to a more fixed asset like the US dollar. So we typically see hyperinflation in those economies because they can't print dollars themselves. Now, with Bitcoin, a huge advantage to them is when the US is using its US dollar reserve status to take labor, labor is the best example. That's the primary reason that we are importing labor out of places like India and China is because India and China artificially lowered their labor costs. And that makes the labor very cheap for us internationally to do that, but that comes at the cost of our own domestic labor force. But when we are doing this process of extracting that wealth, the amount of wealth that we are extracting is hurting these economies over time. So they have a major incentive when they're in that position to want to opt out of this system. And Bitcoin provides them that incentive, and we can kind of see that with El Salvador. And so I published my book in June, and I was calling this out. I think I mentioned just Iran as one of the countries, but it was a few weeks later that the El Salvador news popped up. But we're going to continue to see that with a lot of these types of economies that are kind of on the fringe. So I think that they're going to start adopting Bitcoin as legal tender. And whether or not they have their own public systems, which they're probably going to go for, and it'll come down to a reputation-based system where if you have a public system of, El Salvador chooses their own public currency on top of Bitcoin that's backed in Bitcoin. It comes down to whether or not they're going to print more. It comes down to their long-term incentives and property rights and what they choose to do as a government. So we'll probably see public currencies emerge with the Bitcoin reserve. We'll probably also see them emerge privately with other private forms of like stable coins on top of them or something like that. We might even see the Lightning Network just be what they're using. There's a few different forms that could come in, but the key point is that as those economies start to all opt into the system because they have a very strong incentive to opt into it, we're going to eventually hit a point where we reach critical mass. So I think the question is that signals, every single time a country does that, it signals to the rest of the countries like, oh, they're benefiting from this. And I think the key thing that is going to come, one thing I speculated on back in July was, I bet the GDP of El Salvador doubles within the next few years as it accumulates more Bitcoin reserves. And once that happens, it's going to cause so many other countries to want to adopt it. So as they accumulate that critical mass, once we start to signal to the more major developing economies to opt into the system, I think the whole thing tilts the other direction to where maybe even a G7 country at some point adopts a Bitcoin standard. Is when one of the major economies starts to hyperinflate its own currency to buy Bitcoin with. And it would have to be one of the major economies that's in a pretty extreme scenario. I could see something like that happening in Japan or China. And but anyways, that would be much more long term. But like that, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but that's kind of how I would guess things could play out.
Well, my follow-up question to that would be, just high level, there's probably not enough supply in Bitcoin for that to happen. So if there's not enough supply, price would have to go up for it to be a reserve currency. Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah, it gets tricky because we're dealing with two different unit of accounts. So like we can't think in these terms really. We have to have one unit of account. So like by the time Bitcoin actually gets big enough, we're not going to be denominating it in another currency anymore because that currency is not going to be really worth that much. But Bitcoin, theoretically, if it starts to get adopted over time, if it does become some proportion of world value as money, so there's kind of two big parts to this question. The first, I think, is that there's the hard money piece, like Bitcoin, and there could be people in this room that disagree with me, but I think we've never seen a situation in all of history where we've had one global form of money. So to assume that that is what will happen is questionable. And I think that we will definitely have one form of money that dominates to a very, very large degree. That's probably very certain. It'd be very hard for it to be otherwise, but there could technically be exceptions to that. Nobody really knows. So that's the first piece, is the monetary base. But there's going to be other forms of money. Like credit is a form of money. No, obviously credit, the same way money allows us to move value forward in time, credit allows us to move money back in time. So like that's going to be another big piece that represents value in the world as well. So like when people say today the total value of wealth in the world is around like 400 trillion, a big portion of that market cap is credit. We live in a credit system, so it's pretty much all like, a very large portion of that in the future will still be credit. So like Bitcoin's valuation will consume that valuation less than credit. Best case scenario is kind of how I look at it, if that makes sense. Yeah. You're first.
So this might not be a very well-formed question, but what sort of challenges are there that we all kind of think that Bitcoin's inevitable, like at least probably people in this room do, but what are the challenges that would cause it to not, if not just completely fail, to vastly underperform its potential?
I would say, so it depends on who's thinking of potential. So the first thing I would say is there's a lot of people out there that like, Bitcoin's gonna go to a few hundred trillion or something. By the time we get to a significant mass, obviously it will technically, but the dollar will be very inflated at that point. But to represent that actual value in assets, I think it'll underperform because we aren't really certain of how credit will pan out as a proportion of money in society at that point. I can say that's one argument against it. The other thing would be that there are other forms of currency that exist. So when you look at history, the principles that kind of determine, so in a perfect world, we would want one form of money, right? But what's restricted that from happening was pretty much like sovereign coercion, governments enforcing their own money. You have to use this to participate. Or information opacity, when people didn't have information transparency, and this goes a little bit back further in history, people just didn't know that people were using different forms of money. But with the internet today, that's been largely eliminated, so we don't really have to worry about that as much. So with like those kind of barriers to it, I'd say that will there be people that are in control of property rights of some group of people in the future that are going to enforce their own monetary standards to some degree? Probably to some degree. The question is, for how long are they able to do that and at what scale? And I don't totally know, but something like that I can see happening.
What do you see preventing the, say, U.S. government from not allowing any Bitcoin-related traffic on the network that you're on?
Sorry, say that one more time.
What do you see? What's to stop the U.S. government from stopping any Bitcoin-related traffic on any U.S. network backbone or international backbone that we're on?
I'm not a technology expert, but my understanding is that that is possible. What I do understand is that the U.S. has very strong incentives to not do something like that. if they were to create some sort of system like that, as the rest of the world continues to adopt it, those people that are furthest removed, it increases the incentive for other people to participate. It's that same, going back to that slide on like the network effect. As that continues to grow, the opportunity cost of them opting out of the system will also continue to grow. So if it's possible that, you know, the US could theoretically nationalize telecommunication companies in our democratic system in a fast enough rate to get ahead of Bitcoin, probably very, very unlikely. And we can thank the founding fathers for that. But I think that, you know, even if some crazy scenarios started to emerge in a situation like that, that they have a very strong incentive to probably not take actions that direction.
I agree with your like 1997 concept, right? But that's like potentially very scary because we saw the dot-com collapse. I started my career in '97. I tell a lot of people, like, with respect to Bitcoin, we're in 1997. My friends were insulated by high school and college during dot-com collapse while I was living it. Like, and the history of Bitcoin is like these enormous boom and busts. And we continue to see that as Bitcoin establishes itself. And then on the democratic process, like, even the Lightning Network white paper calls for 50 megabyte blocks. So what do you see in terms of the Bitcoin community waking up to the scaling of the network?
So I don't know enough about the Lightning Network to talk about how it's going to scale. But I think that, yeah, I'm sorry, your first question was...
Yeah, it's like the ominous nature of your 1997.
Yeah. Just like how that's going to be negative.
Well, I just mean like the dot-com collapse started in 1999 under Clinton, and then we blamed
just
it.
the volatility. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's a big question with Bitcoin is, will the volatility decrease as the network continues to scale? And there's...
I mean, I bought at 60,000, but I'm looking at 30,000 in a couple years.
I highly doubt that, but I have no idea. It could happen. But I think that as it continues to scale, we do see that volatility does decrease. And the question is once we get to a few trillion in market cap, or we get to like the size of gold, I mean, gold is still something that's very volatile, but it's a really big question. So like, do we see volatility decrease with scale? Yes. Do we see more functioning credit markets start to support it that cause a lot of that volatility as it scales? Yes. But the bigger thing is, like, it's hard to understand is we're currently in a very different regime right now. So Bitcoin exists within this current regime. As we moved into a sound money regime, a lot of these causes of a lot of the credit contractions that exist on top of Bitcoin would just kind of be fundamentally different. So it's hard to say, but I do, you know, when you think about it, before we did get involved in a lot of these fractional reserve systems, people existed on these very scarce resources as money in more localized, smaller communities for most of history. So will it be functional? Will it be a necessary cost of having a little bit more volatility than something that's always inflating its way into maintaining stability? I think likely so. There you go. Yeah. Okay, thanks.